The words hung in the studio air like smoke from a dying cigarette. It was March 1963, deep inside Hitsville, USA, and the afternoon session had been going nowhere for 3 hours. Marvin Gaye stood behind the microphone, sweat beading on his forehead, his voice growing hoarse from repeated takes of a song that would never see the light of day. "Cut!" barked Mickey Stevenson, Motown's head of A&R, his finger jabbing the talkback button with barely concealed frustration. "Marvin, come out here." The 23-year-old singer pulled off his headphones and walked into the control room, his shoulders carrying the weight of another failed recording session. Through the thick glass, he could see the Funk Brothers, James Jamerson on bass, Benny Benjamin on drums, Joe Messina on guitar, packing up their instruments. They had given their best, as always. The problem wasn't the music. Mickey Stevenson was a man who had built his reputation on being brutally honest about what worked and what didn't in the rapidly evolving world of rhythm and blues. He had discovered Martha Reeves, helped shape the Marvelettes, and turned the Temptations from a street corner group into polished professionals. When he spoke, artists listened, even when they didn't want to hear what he had to say. "Sit down, kid," Mickey said, not looking up from the mixing board. "We need to talk." Marvin lowered himself into a folding chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had been with Motown for 3 years, ever since Berry Gordy had signed him as a session drummer. He had played on countless hits for other artists, watching from behind his drum kit as voices like Mary Wells and Smokey Robinson created magic in these same rooms. But his own recording career had been a series of near misses and commercial disappointments. "Your voice," Mickey began, finally turning to face him. "It's too soft for real soul." The statement hit Marvin like a physical blow. He had grown up in church, singing gospel with his father's congregation, learning to pour his heart into every note. His voice had been his sanctuary during a childhood marked by his father's violent temper and his mother's quiet suffering. When he sang, the pain became something beautiful, something that could touch other people's hearts. "I don't understand," Marvin said quietly. Mickey leaned back in his chair, his expression not unkind but unforgiving. "Look, you've got technical skill. Nobody's questioning that. But when I listen to you sing, I hear politeness. I hear somebody who's afraid to let people see what's really inside." The control room fell silent except for the low hum of the equipment. Outside in the hallway, voices and footsteps suggested that other sessions were beginning, other artists taking their chances with the Motown machine. "You want to know what real soul sounds like?" Mickey continued. "It sounds like somebody who's got nothing left to lose. It sounds like pain that's been living in your chest so long, it's become part of your breathing. When Ray Charles sings, you believe he's been through hell. When James Brown screams, you know he means every word. But when you sing, Marvin, I hear somebody trying not to disturb the neighbors." Marvin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Those who knew him well would have recognized the sign, the way his face would go still when something had cut too deep. But Mickey was focused on making his point, not reading the subtle shifts in the young man's demeanor. "The label's been patient with you," Mickey said. "Barry likes you personally, respects your musicianship, but at some point we need to see some return on our investment, and right now you're not giving us anything that's going to make people rush to the record store." The words were delivered without malice, but they landed with devastating precision. Marvin had spent his entire life feeling like he wasn't enough, not tough enough for his father's approval, not good enough for the success he watched other artists achieve, not strong enough to protect himself from the violence that had shaped his childhood. "What are you saying?" Marvin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying maybe it's time to think about your future here at Motown. There are other roles, other ways to contribute. You're a hell of a drummer, and you've got a good ear for arranging. Maybe that's where your talents really lie." Mickey stood up, apparently considering the conversation finished. "Take some time to think about it. We'll talk again next week." But Marvin didn't move. He remained in the folding chair, staring at the mixing board with its rows of knobs and faders, the technological heart of the Motown sound. For a long moment, the only sound was the ventilation system cycling air through the building. "Play it back," Marvin said finally. "What?" "The last take. Play it back." Mickey frowned but reached for the tape machine controls. "Marvin, we've heard it enough times. It's not working." "Please." Something in the younger man's voice made Mickey pause. There was a quality there that hadn't been present during the session, a depth that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his vocal cords. Mickey rewound the tape and hit play. Marvin's voice filled the control room, singing the lyrics to a forgettable love song with technical proficiency but, as Mickey had pointed out, without the raw emotional power that defined the greatest soul singers. "Stop it," Marvin said halfway through the first verse. Mickey stopped the tape. "See what I mean?" "No," Marvin said, standing up slowly. "I see what you mean about politeness, about being afraid." He walked back toward the studio door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Can I try something else?" Mickey checked his watch. The studio was booked for another session in an hour, but something in Marvin's demeanor had shifted. The resignation was gone, replaced by something that Mickey couldn't quite identify. "5 minutes," Mickey said. Marvin nodded and disappeared back into the studio. Through the glass, Mickey watched him adjust the microphone stand and put his headphones back on. But instead of standing in the formal posture that most Motown artists adopted, Marvin pulled up a stool and sat down, cradling the microphone like he was holding a conversation with an old friend. "What do you want for music?" Mickey asked through the talkback. "Nothing," Marvin replied. "Just roll the tape." Mickey shrugged and hit record. Whatever was about to happen, it would either be brilliantly unconventional or a complete waste of tape. What followed was unlike anything Mickey had ever heard in a Motown studio. Marvin began to sing, but not any recognizable song. Instead, he seemed to be improvising, his voice moving through a melody that felt ancient and immediate at the same time. The words, when they came, were about growing up in a house where love and violence existed in the same spaces, where Sunday morning gospel gave way to Sunday afternoon rage, where a child learned to make himself small and quiet to avoid becoming a target. His voice, freed from the constraints of commercial expectations, revealed layers that had been hidden beneath years of trying to please. There was pain there, yes, but not the performative anguish of someone trying to sound soulful. This was the sound of someone who had learned to carry hurt so gracefully that it had become part of his breath, part of his heartbeat. As Marvin sang, his voice grew softer rather than louder, drawing Mickey closer to the speakers rather than pushing him back. This wasn't the explosive power of a James Brown or the sanctified desperation of a Ray Charles. This was something else entirely, an intimacy that made the listener feel like they were being trusted with secrets. The improvised song, if it could be called a song, lasted less than 4 minutes. When it ended, Marvin simply set down the microphone and looked through the glass at Mickey. Not with defiance or expectation, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally told the truth. Mickey sat in the control room chair, his finger hovering over the talkback button, unable to speak. In 3 decades of working with singers, he had never heard anything quite like what had just happened. It wasn't loud or showy or conventionally powerful, but it was undeniably real. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither man was sure how to cross. Mickey had built his career on quick judgments, on knowing instantly whether a performance had commercial potential or artistic merit. But this defied his usual categories. It wasn't radio-friendly in any conventional sense, yet it possessed something that made him want to hear it again immediately. Through the studio window, Mickey could see that Marvin remained seated on the stool, his hands folded in his lap, waiting. There was no urgency in his posture, no desperate need for approval or validation. He had said what he needed to say, and now he was simply present with whatever would follow. "Play it back," Mickey said, rewinding the tape with trembling fingers. As Marvin's voice filled the control room again, Mickey noticed details he had missed the first time. The way certain phrases seemed to hang in the air, like conversations overheard through thin walls. The moments where Marvin's voice cracked not from technical failure, but from emotional precision. The spaces between words where silence carried as much weight as sound. When the playback ended, Mickey found himself staring at the tape machine as if it might offer explanations for what had just occurred. He had heard thousands of auditions, hundreds of recording sessions, dozens of breakthrough moments. But this felt different. This felt like witnessing someone discover themselves in real time. "That," Mickey said finally, his voice barely audible through the talkback, "is your voice." Marvin nodded slowly, understanding that something fundamental had shifted in the room. The conversation that had begun with criticism and disappointment had transformed into something neither man had expected, a moment of genuine artistic revelation. "I need to ask you something," Mickey said, leaning forward in his chair. "Where did that come from? That wasn't something you've been practicing or planning." That was, that was me," Marvin interrupted quietly. "That was what it sounds like when I stopped trying to be somebody else." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went beyond music or career considerations. Mickey realized he was witnessing something rare in the industry, an artist finding their authentic voice not through years of development or careful coaching, but through the simple act of letting go of expectations. Over the following months, everything changed. Mickey worked with Marvin to find songs that suited his particular gift for intimate revelation, rather than trying to force him into the mold of more traditional soul singers. They discovered that Marvin's voice was most effective when it wasn't competing for attention, but instead drawing listeners into a private space where vulnerability became a form of strength. The breakthrough came with Pride and Joy, a song that allowed Marvin to be tender without being weak, romantic without being saccharine. When it was released in the spring of 1963, it reached number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100, proving that there was indeed an audience for the kind of quiet intensity that had been dismissed as too soft. But the real transformation wasn't commercial, it was personal. That afternoon in the studio had forced Marvin to confront the difference between hiding his pain and transforming it. He had learned that true strength sometimes looked like gentleness, that the most powerful voices weren't always the loudest ones. Mickey Stevenson would later say that the 5-minute improvised session changed how he understood the relationship between vulnerability and power in music. He had been looking for artists who could command attention through force, but Marvin had shown him that attention could also be earned through honesty. For Marvin, the lesson went deeper. He had spent years trying to be what he thought others wanted him to be, only to discover that his greatest strength lay in being exactly what he was. A man who could transform private pain into public beauty, who could make silence feel more powerful than screaming. The improvised recording from that session was never released, but it became something of a legend within Motown's walls. Engineers and producers would sometimes reference it when working with other artists, describing a performance that couldn't be replicated, but could serve as a reminder of what was possible when someone stopped trying to impress and started trying to communicate. Years later, when Marvin created What's Going On and revolutionized the possibilities of soul music, the roots of that artistic courage could be traced back to the afternoon when a producer told him his voice was too soft, and he decided to prove just how powerful softness could be. The young man who had walked into Studio A that day, believing he needed to be louder and tougher, had discovered something more valuable. That his voice was perfect exactly as it was. That his particular way of carrying pain and hope could touch people in ways that conventional soul power never could. But the journey from that moment of revelation to artistic mastery wasn't immediate or easy. In the weeks following the session with Mickey, Marvin found himself caught between two versions of himself, the performer who had spent years trying to fit into Motown's established mold, and the artist who had glimpsed his authentic voice in those 4 minutes of improvisation. Some days he would return to the studio and attempt to recreate that raw honesty, only to find himself falling back into old patterns of trying too hard to impress. Other days he would sit at home with his guitar, singing softly to himself, rediscovering the particular quality of vulnerability that had moved Mickey to tears. The struggle was internal but visible to those who worked with him. Session musicians noticed that Marvin had become more introspective, more likely to ask for multiple takes, not because he had made technical errors, but because he was searching for something deeper in each performance. Producers found him more collaborative, but also more insistent about maintaining the emotional integrity of his interpretations. Martha Reeves, who had witnessed the transformation from a distance, later described watching Marvin during this period as seeing someone learn to trust themselves for the first time. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was profound. Like watching someone gradually realize they had been holding their breath for years and finally learning how to breathe naturally. In the end, Mickey Stevenson had been wrong about what real soul sounded like. It didn't always sound like someone with nothing left to lose. Sometimes it sounded like someone who had learned to hold on to everything they cared about so gently that others could feel the weight of that caring in every note. That afternoon in 1963 became a turning point, not just for Marvin's career, but for his understanding of himself as an artist. He had learned that authenticity wasn't about conforming to someone else's definition of strength, but about finding the courage to reveal the particular way that life had shaped his voice. The lesson would serve him well in the years to come, as he navigated the complexities of fame, love, loss, and the constant pressure to evolve as both an artist and a human being. But it all began with the moment he stopped trying to be what a producer expected and started being who he actually was. A man whose greatest power lay not in volume, but in the fearless intimacy of his whispered truths. The studio where it happened still exists, though it has been converted into a museum. Visitors can stand in the same spot where Marvin sat that day, where his voice first revealed its true nature. Tour guides tell the story, but they can't replicate the atmosphere of that moment, the weight of disappointment that preceded it, the courage it took to try again, or the silence that followed when everyone in the room realized they had witnessed something extraordinary.